When Shinichi thought how the entire 20th century so far had been an uninterrupted succession of mass killing, his heart filled with anger and grief. In 1903, as the new century opened, a young Sunesaburo Makiguchi, later the founding president of the Soka Gakkai, published his first book, The Geography of Human Life, Jinsei Chirigaku. In it, he touches on the competition for survival fought among societies and nations. Makiguchi posited four types of competition: military, political, economic, and humanitarian, and voiced his hope that humankind would move towards the last. This was in the year before the Russo Japanese War, in which Japan and Russia fought for control over Korea and Manchuria. Mr. Makiguchi's vision was far ahead of his times. In the years that followed, however, the nations of the world had entered into frenzied military competition, embarking on one war after another. Japan was a key player in this scramble for military supremacy. The war, it interpreted, would split the blood of untold members before Japan was finally brought to a ruinous defeat. The Japanese government's policy of thought control was a major factor in the nationalistic and militaristic mood that permeated that society and led to Japan's mad rush to war. The most conspicuous expression of this policy was the establishment of the so called Peace Preservation Law. The Peace Preservation Law, which was in force in Japan from 1925 to 1945, is recognized today as one of the history's most reprehensible statutes. What led to its establishment? World War I had produced a huge economic boom for Japan, making industrialists and speculators rich. Skyrocketing prices, however, put great strain on people's livelihoods, eventually triggering a series of rice riots in which people took to the streets in often violent protest of the high price of that daily staple. This period of seething unrest during the Taisho era, 1912 to 26, saw the emergence of mass movements of all persuasions: democratic, socialist, and communist. Organized labor, farmers, and women's movements lobbied for freedom of speech, publication, and association, and for universal suffrage. Also called for was party government, in which the ruling cabinet would be made up of members of the House of Representatives, that is lower house, belonging to the party with the majority popular vote. These protest movements represented that what historians later came to call Taisho democracy. In 1924, amid a rising movement to protect constitutional government, a party cabinet was restored with a three-party coalition led by Takaki Kato. The new government drew up a universal manhood suffrage bill that would grant voting rights to all males over age 25. But many officials and bureaucrats feared that holding elections in which workers and farmers could vote would lead to socialists and similar elements gaining seats in the lower house. This fear was strengthened by the signing of the Soviet Japanese Basic Convention in January 1925. Under this agreement, Japan and the newly established communist regime of the Soviet Union normalized relations and guaranteed reciprocal freedoms to citizens of both countries in each other's territories. Hence, alarm grew among Japanese officials, and they concluded that they would have to take measures to guard against the influx of socialist and communist ideology. At the time, it was granting wider freedoms to its citizens through the introduction of the universal manhood suffrage law. Japan's government was also moving to enforce ideological control over them. In March 1925, even before the universal manhood suffrage law had been implemented, the government passed the bill for the Peace Preservation Law. With the introduction of the Peace Preservation Law, anyone organizing a group or association with the intent of altering the Kokutai national policy or voicing opposition to the system of personal property was now subject to prosecution. The Kokutai was the political system centered on the emperor, whom the Meiji Constitution of 1889 had enshrined as sacred and inviolable, and the descendant of a lenient succession unbroken through the ages. Ironically, just when the fruit of Taisho democracy, the universal manhood suffrage law, was about to be harvested, the peace preservation law, which rode roughshod over people's civil liberties, was introduced by the same party cabinet. At the outset, few people could recognize the real nature and danger of this law. In 1928, a revision of the Peace Preservation Law was implemented. The most significant changes were the addition of the death penalty and life imprisonment to the list of possible sentences for violators. Just as a single termite can ultimately lead to the destruction of an entire house, this law was to undermine and eventually lay waste the foundation of liberty and civil rights in Japan. When political authority runs amok, it will invariably interfere in people's thinking and religious beliefs. People must realize, therefore, that unless they are prepared to fight to defend freedom of thought and religious beliefs, they will find themselves plunged into an ominous and oppressive age of darkness. This indeed is an unchanging truth that has been borne out through time and history. In December 1926, the curtain opened on the Showa period, the start of the reign of Emperor Hirohito. A post World War I recession and the Great Tokyo earthquake of 1923 had dealt successive blows in the Japanese economy. And while the country had still not fully recovered from those economic shocks, it was buffeted by the Great Depression of 1929. It was an era of violent change, both domestically and internationally. Series, Serious social uncertainty led to a growing nationalist mood, and the military increased its influence in the government circles. The Soka Kyoko Gakkai Society for Value Creating Education, the forerunner of the Soka Gakkai, was born in 1930 in the very midst of this turbulent age. The following year saw the outbreak of the Manchurian Incident, which would lead Japan into a 15-year conflict with China, ultimately becoming the Sino Japanese War of 1937 to 1945. Many Japanese citizens supported the fighting in Manchuria due largely to mass media reports preventing them from learning the true nature of the conflict. An example of this was the reports on the bombing of the South Manchuria Railway Company, the direct catalyst for the Manchurian incident. Japanese newspapers and radio reported only news the military had fabricated and made no attempt to protest Japan's attack on Manchuria.